it's going.
For this lecture, and the purposes of this lecture, we will be discussing argument by analogy. To begin, we'll start with what is analogy. As the entire system state that is the universe, so this equation here, which represents basically the almost sinusoidal wave of the universe, that this wave function cannot be expressed in its entirety in the form of communication. So, granted, since we cannot communicate the entirety of the system in one chunk of information, the social contract thusly asserts that what is communicated is a representation or a small continuum of concepts or data sets out of that entire system state that is the universe. So it is not an assertion of the system state itself, but it is an assertion of a small portion of what can be referred to as the continuum of concepts that this data set produces through the purposes of communication. Now, this asserts communication, and that analogy is an important tool for communication, as if a person were to try to describe to another person this is what's going on in the universe as I perceive it, and this is this is my this is my method of being able to take a portion of this entire system state and being able to collapse it down into a data chunk that's small enough that a human being can process that information. So basically, in some ways, what we're saying here is that we understand that all information is subjective, and we use analogy to, or at least, not all information is subjective, but all information perceived by one of these conscious system states would be a collapse of that system state into zero-point perturbation, which would explain the subjectivity of the conscious observer. So, due to the fact that the collapsing of the entire system state is only a portion of the collapsing of the entire system state as it's perceived through eyes, ears, nose, mouth, whatever sensory organs that are being used in order to measure, that is understood to be only a small portion, a small subjective portion of that system state. So, as soon as analogy comes into the metaphysical construct of communication here, all of a sudden human beings are able to start communicating portions of that system state in such a way as to advance science, advance rigor, advance the concept of information, that kind of thing. So basically what that means is that the information that is being provided by these consciousnesses is improving with analogy. Furthermore, what we found is, and this is based on reinforcement learning by Chomsky on behaviorism, that there's a portion of intellectual drift, which through analogy, you're able to positive and operantly condition animals, people, certain whatever cells, I guess. However, that only works up until a certain point. So this goes back to reinforce the concept that the system state that's being communicated is subjective, and that it does not hold valid in all cases necessarily. There is some instinctual drift, so that means there is a plateau. So if there's an exponential curve, there's a plateau at which the analogy or reward is able to function and provide its reward stimulus. So now we have the information, or the transmission of information is now possible through analogy. So once you have the ability to transmit information from one human being to another, and that transmission is dependent upon awareness, so and this holds true even in animals, or valid even in animals, not true, valid even in animals, that that it's dependent upon awareness. So the animal or organism has to be aware that they are being positive and outwardly conditioned. So in some fashion, it takes some level of a certain type of cognition to catalyze the information that's processed from the system state and collapse down into your neurological state, whatever. So human development of language became very dependent on this very important tool. So the ability to bring analogies to things. The important tool allowed for the framework of chunking. And this is as of analogy as a core of cognition on YouTube. This is Dr. Hofstadter, who claims that chunking is what makes processing information possible, communication possible. It is a series of continuum of concepts, only in a much larger scale. So with analogies allows chunking, so now the species has the ability to communicate through analogy. Then they're able to communicate larger concepts, more complex concepts through analogy, which becomes the standard tool for symbolic logic. So as an example, symbolic logic, mathematics, all of those things are all representations of analogy. So you're taking some construct and you're bringing it into contrast with another construct in some fashion, as to say, this is like this. So with symbolic logic, an example of that would be let 1 equal a unit. All of a sudden now we have, we're using analogies. We're using an analogy of 1 for unit, and all of a sudden now we have mathematics. We have the ability to take information through symbolic logic and analogy and apply rigor to it in such a way as to produce more accurate and precise information. As far as the argument by analogy, so we've established what analogy is. And as far as our argument by analogy, we can go back to our symbolic logic friend here and see that any argument that can be made with an analogy, or any argument that can be made symbolically, is being made through an analogy. So, if that's the case, then any argument that extends from symbolic logic extends from analogy, and any logic that stems from analogy stems from the understanding that it is not assertion of the system state, but only a portion of the system state subjectively. Then you have the processing and the metaphysical construct of what an analogy is, and now you have that construct applied through symbolic logic or through the ability to transmit information, and you're left with the ability to make arguments logically and and you're able to do so through this use of analogy.